Hello, and welcome to our Week 3 review of our Holistic Leaders Yoga School. In today's lesson, we'll be covering the history of yoga. So, as a quick review, we're still in the section of exploring Jnana Yoga, or the yoga of the mind and the philosophy. And, with Jnana Yoga, this more philosophical approach, I think getting to look back to the history where all of our different paths of yoga emerge is very interesting. And when we look all the way back, we see that the essence and the core of the teaching is very relevant, in fact, to even our contemplative tree of practices. So the previous week, if you recall, we looked over the different contemplative practices. At the core is the foundation of, at the base of the tree, there's this foundation of all practices leading to deepening one's self-awareness or a connection, communion to something greater. And then there's all these different sorts of branches. You have rituals, relationships, you have movement, and just a variety of different branches. But the branch that is most important, and what they say is the most powerful, is the stillness branch. And stillness, being practices like our meditation, really goes back to the foundation in the history of yoga. So, where does yoga come from? Well, really, if you trace the practice back, before we even have writings, before 4000 BCE, we've got, the shamans and the mystics and the sages who spent time out in nature because, well, quite frankly, back in that time, they didn't have a lot of structures. So what did they talk about? Things in nature. And so shamanism being an approach that's very focused on the elements, talking about the earth, wind, fire, the spirit, and these shamans and their wisdom and their teaching and discovering the truth about life all started to get written down in what's known as the Vedas. And the Vedas are the history of where we get most Eastern thought. They essentially lasted between 4000 BCE and 1000 BCE. So for, around 3000 millennia. And with these, what they wrote about were sort of these hymns, or these short hymns giving a wisdom about life, existence, nature, our well-being, consciousness. The oldest known one is the Rig Veda. So there's a variety of different Vedas, tons of different authors throughout the millennia. But the Rig Veda is the oldest. And when we look to where the history of yoga really came from, and we look to these oldest writings, really the core teaching was not about our physical practices that we think of yoga today. Really, it was all meditation, and particularly it was Bhakti Yoga. It was the yoga of chanting and repeating an intention, a sacred hymn of sacred Veda, and with the intention that in chanting this, I can reveal the truth of it, that my mind and consciousness could become one with the intention of that chant, one with a closer consciousness with God, the universe, whatever you want to call it. So this is actually, when we look to modern day, this historical foundation is now probably closely translated to our modern day practices of mantra or Bhakti Yoga is kirtan, calm response singing. So this is kind of where we get the original history and very metaphysical stuff. Now what comes after the Vedas, we get Vedanta philosophy, which literally stands for after the Vedas. And Vedanta philosophy is known as the Upanishads. So the Upanishads, which are actually translated as sitting at the feet of the teacher or the guru, a lineage and a period of time between 1000 BCE and 0, the turn of the century. This period of time really focused on rituals and contemplative practices for uniting our Atman and our Brahman. And these are the Atman is known to be like our individual soul that still is connected to everything, but our individual soul, and Brahman being the greater soul, the soul of God. These are practices to merge these two things together. So this is where they start to give mention of things like our nadis, or the 72,000 energy channels or rivers that flow through the body. And so you start to learn things like breathing practices and techniques and pranayama practices to clear the energetic channels. So now we're not just chanting the name of God, but we're starting to think about our breathing techniques to get there, and rituals, and we're passing it from teacher to student. But you still have to understand that this, in the Upanishads and the Vedas, this is still a very renunciate path. It's still a very recluse. We're renouncing most of the world. It's a dualist perspective. There is things that are of the spirit, there are things of the material, and they're separate. But in this, it's a very removed from normal life sort of path. And so the Upanishads, as the century turns from around 2nd century BCE to around the 2nd century CE, we start to make the shift into wanting to bring this into the world. So a lot of compilation of poems and hymns started to collect in what's known as the Mahabharata. And the specific one that relates to yoga is the Bhagavad Gita, which is translated as the Song of God. And so in the Bhagavad Gita and in this whole Mahabharata, they're starting to make up stories. Stories to teach these lessons with characters to children, to people in a common way. You think about modern day, how do we learn about our morals and ethics? A lot of it is through TV and storytelling, Disney, and we don't see those characters as being literal people. Likewise, that those characters in the Gita and the Mahabharata may not be literal characters, but they're characters that we grow to love and learn and impart wisdom on life and our morals. So the Bhagavad Gita is the continuation of the Upanishads, and it's a story of Arjuna and his charioteer Krishna getting carried into battle. And this is a story about Arjuna having to be on this battlefield, looking around and seeing many of his friends, family, teachers, and this existential challenge of having to come to war with them. And this battle is symbolic of the own many battles we have in our lives, the own battle for our mind and soul. And it's not an easy one. And so this is where we start to get the notion, the idea of dharma, or your sacred duty. And we also start to get the 3 more paths of yoga. We get not only Bhakti Yoga, but we also get Karma Yoga, the yoga of service, in addition to Jnana Yoga, or the yoga of the mind and wisdom. And through these stories, these 700 poems and hymns in the Bhagavad Gita, or as it's known as the Gita, we learn about these different pathways. And similarly, shortly after the Gita, around the 200 CE, what starts to be written is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is where most of our modern yoga is said to be systematized. It was the first time where we put together a regular system of a practice, and that system's known through the 8 limbs of your yamas, your restraints, your niyamas, the things you're observing within yourself, your asana, pranayama, your pratyahara, drawing the attention inward, and then the deeper states of dharana, starting to concentrate and focus your mind, dhyana, where you finally achieve single focus or meditation, which eventually opens up to samadhi or kaivalya or enlightenment, which also has its own different levels of union. This is where we start to get that 8-limb system. And, in terms of who wrote the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, whether or not Patanjali was one person, several people, some even equate him to mythical character who's known as a half human, half serpent, and there's a whole mythological story related to it. But more importantly than who wrote it is what it is, and it's these 196 aphorisms. So we don't just get the 8 limbs. There's all sorts of aphorisms, 196, that are divided into 4 books, or 4 chapters. A chapter on enlightenment, a chapter on the practice, on the powers that arise, and ultimately on that deeper stages of enlightenment. So, when we move through these short little aphorisms, we have to understand they're very short, very terse, very to the point, and they're sewn together. Sutra means, thread sewn together. It's from the same word suture that we get nowadays. But in this, we have to understand that these short aphorisms were, to communicate to an unarticulate culture, that in each aphorism a teacher would impart a variety of wisdom. So these aphorisms are very short. It would allow for a student to remember that short thing, and then they would give them a variety of teachings underneath it. So now there's tons of versions of the sutras. Honestly, there's tons of versions of the Gita or translations. But the variety of Yoga Sutra translations, that's where we start to get some of the interpretations of the different practices that hang on each of those aphorisms or lessons. And every translation's a little different, so you pick the one that speaks most to you. So after the sutras, what starts to emerge is Mahayana Buddhism comes over in this lineage of Tantra Yoga. Now, Tantra Yoga nowadays has gotten a very different rep from its original teaching, though it maintains a lot of its original core essence. What Tantra Yoga, in the way that it brought a whole new revitalization to a dark period, it came around 700 CE, so many years after the sutras, where spirituality needed a revitalization. They called it a dark age or Kali Yuga. This revitalization, instead of seeing it as a dualistic system where some things are spiritual, chanting in a cave, doing your pranayama, doing your Jnana yoga, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, now they're starting to say that anything and everything in life has God in it, every particle, and so anything can be a means towards enlightenment and liberation. So this new movement included much more practices. This is where we start to get really the history of all of our asana poses, where instead of just needing to sit cross-legged to the point where our low backs and hips start to hurt, now we start to think, okay, maybe I should stretch my body out and take care of it. The physical body could be a means to enlightenment, as well as in the Tantra lineage, they give practices of pranayama, mudras, and so something else still to know about Tantra is it's said to be an embodiment of the feminine energy. So this is where, there's a feminine energetic rising in values, which is important. Other practices that you get in addition to the asana, the pranayama, the mudras are very common mantras, so they still have the repetitive chanting, but also yantra, following sacred geometric patterns to visually, artistically focus the mind. And lastly, pujas, or rituals where you're honoring deities. So it's actually from Tantra coming and starting to honor the body that we really get the full development of the physical practice of yoga in our modern day, or Hatha Yoga. And Hatha Yoga comes from the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. It was written in 15th century CE. We know this date very clearly. And by Swami Swata Murananda. And in this practice, we really start to learn more about asana, pranayama. Asana as a physical practice to purify the body. Pranayama to purify the energetic body, the subtle body. Your Shakkarma to clear out any mucus. These are your kriyas, your 6 cleansing practices. As well as mudras, or your hand positions to seal the energy, and your bandhas to energetically lock energy within the system. So the Hatha Yoga Pradipika is where we really can see a lot of our modern day yoga, and it all still carries this original mystical, before 4000 BCE, shamans and sages and knowledge of existence. So when we're looking at it, we have to realize that the physical practice of yoga has really just been something the last 500-600 years, that really the rich 1,000-year-old practice is meditation. So when we look to that origin where we got Bhakti Yoga, where it starts to expand more into Karma Yoga, as well as Jnana Yoga, ultimately coming up to Raja Yoga and the Sutras, Tantra, and now Hatha, we have to see that teachers met the culture in the time period and continue to evolve it. And that evolves us all the way up to our current period and the variety of yoga lineages and styles of practice. So in the next week, we're really going to go deeply into learning about the different styles of yoga, the different lineages of yoga, in the modern day history. So hopefully we can find how to apply the ancient history to our modern day, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.